But yes, obviously it looks like now we've got a lot of people back. It's 1 p.m, so it's probably a good time to start. And as people filter in, obviously they can be admitted. But we will begin then with the next keynote address, which is being given today by Andy Pike, whose talk I think will fit really well with the themes of this. I'm quite excited that something like this is being addressed for this conference. Andy Pike is the Henry Daish Professor of Regional Development Studies in the Centre for Urban and Regional Development Studies at Newcastle University in the UK. His research interests, publication, and research projects are focused on the geographical, political economy of local, regional, and urban development and policy. He has undertaken research projects for the OECD, UNILO, European Commission, UK government, as well as national, regional, and local institutions. He is a fellow of the Regional Studies Association and an elected academician of the UK's National Academy of Sciences. And today he will be presenting a talk called Councillors at the Casino, Financialization and Local Statecraft in Austerity and Centralisation in England from 2000 onward. So as with the previous addresses, we will have about 40 to 45 minutes for the presentation, followed by another 45 minutes of discussion, which has so far proved really good time to be able to follow up on topics from the presentation. So I will welcome and turn it over to Andy Pike now. Thank you very much for your presentation today.
Right. Well, thanks very much, Neve, and the other organisers for the invitation and for the opportunity to contribute to the discussions yesterday and today. I've kind of been able to dip in and out of various of the sessions, and very interesting stuff. Really some interesting fine-grained analysis of questions of poverty and debts and kind of responses to austerity. So some really interesting questions around agency and what can be done locally amongst social groups. And I think as well some interesting connections through to some well, other strands, I suppose, of sort of bigger concepts, macro ideas, I suppose, that yeah, us geographers maybe haven't come across so readily. So yeah, it's been very interesting today. So thanks a lot for that. I guess well, today's talk, I want to try and focus on some work we've been doing. I'll share some slides around local government. So in a way, it's sort of stepping into the institutions that in a way have been sort of forced into generating austerity locally, that many of the other talks have been kind of trying to then understand the impacts thereof. So hopefully this will help fill in a little piece of the broader picture. This is very much focused on, I guess, critically engaging with this councillors at the casino narrative, which started to emerge in local government circles in England following 2010 and the coalition government's introduction of austerity. So this idea that local government were getting involved in almost gambling with public money. They were being forced into making cuts, but also trying to generate new sources of revenue and income to try and balance their budgets in response to the expenditure reductions at national level. And there were some very high profile cases of particularly district councils in the outer southeast borrowing up to £1 billion and spending it on investing in commercial property to generate revenue to try and balance their books. So the kind of sector press, as well as the broader press, got hold of this idea of councillors at the casino speculating with taxpayers' money and jeopardising local public service provision. And I guess what I've been trying to do over the last year or so is really sort of question some of this. There's been some very good work, particularly by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, on looking at what they called a local public service gamble, with councils portrayed as borrowing billions to play the property market. The Financial Times has become at times apoplectic about this idea of local authorities with a debt addiction engaging in these kind of speculative activities, encroaching on the private actors formerly engaged in commercial property markets with cheap UK sovereign-backed debt. And as John Plender put it, this quirky and hazardous corner of British public finance. So basically the Public Works Loan Board that operates as an arm of the UK Treasury's Debt Management Office then kind of affords relatively low-cost debt to local authorities, primarily for investment in their own kind of provision of public services. But some of this borrowing has been used for more speculative activities. So the councillors at the casino narrative is something I wanted to look more problematically at as part of this, and connecting it in with debates around how we understand what local government's about and what it does, and the local state more broadly, and questions around financialisation, the extent to which local government is now becoming more engaged with external financial logics, commercial finance actors, and the broader process of financialisation. So I want to try and talk a little bit about that today. It's a bit of a cook's tour in a sense, because it kind of tries to highlight some of the key arguments from a book that will be coming out later this summer, hopefully, on financialisation and local statecraft. So that's the substance. There'll be a lot more detail. I'll just touch upon some of the key arguments from that, really, and give some kind of evidence in what follows. And then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for some questions and discussion and debate about where this goes and where it goes next, because it kind of took it up from 2010 right the way up to sort of 2019-20. But there's a whole other book about the impact of the pandemic. And of course, we've been hearing from some of the presentations that have been really interesting as that pandemic, post-pandemic kind of consequences of local state and public service provision. And there's a whole other story and a kind of wealth of research I'm sure that we'll all be active in the years to come. So the first one, I suppose, is really just trying to, I guess, think about what this book can do in theoretical terms and conceptual terms. And it's been using an idea, I suppose, borrowed really in some senses from Jim Bulpitt's territorial politics in the UK from the early 80s, which kind of looked at the national question of statecraft and how the national government borrowed or managed and thought about central government relations. And in previous work, previous book on financialising city statecraft and infrastructure, we try to develop this idea of statecraft at a subnational scale to try and understand how local governments and local government actors, so it gave a more agency sort of oriented conception of political economy, we hope, was really involved in trying to manage these state relations with national state government departments, non-departmental public bodies, but also with other private, civic and other public actors across a range of geographical scales, because we were trying to argue that, okay, there was a kind of pragmatic politics and agency involved in this statecraft, but crucially, it was taking place at the subnational level. It was much more kind of shaped by economic logics. And arguably, too, it was involving a much wider set of actors than just that central local relations, which has always been the kind of focus, if you like, of traditional political science accounts. So what we try to do in this book more formally then is to develop this idea of local statecraft as a way of trying to capture what local governments have been getting up to. In a way, it's been trying to break with some work that's been in urban studies and human geography around these urban transitions. So the idea of urban managerialism to urban entrepreneurialism, the David Harvey sort of transformation framework. We've been trying to argue that there's too much continuity and kind of change to really sort of sustain this kind of transformation framework type understanding. So we've been trying to move in perhaps a more sort of contingent, sort of contextualized, I guess, understandings and explanations really of what's been going on. So that's been one of the first things that we've been trying to do, and really again it echoes, I think, nicely a lot of the talks we've had, having this much more sort of agency oriented understanding of what's going on, recognizing that structural constraints, systemic rationales and so forth and logics are really important, but perhaps we've neglected in some ways in social science these more agency oriented aspects of what's going on, which is producing a great deal of diversity, particularly when we start looking in this kind of subnational and local space. So in the book, we try and sort of elaborate this idea of the local statecrafter. So, these are the people doing the statecraft, and these, for local government in England at least, are elected councillors from their wards locally and appointed officers, chief financial officers, for example. And they're the ones who are actually doing the statecraft, exercising the statecraft in what we've described in the book as these specific realms, so these particular areas where they're active. And those are very much framed, particularly in the English setting, by a very, very centralised structure in terms of the national sort of constitutional, legal, regulatory and institutional sort of structures in which they work. We have a very, very centralised system for local government, as we'll come on to. In other countries, US or other federal states, you have a much more decentralised system and your statecraft would be different as a result. But certainly within England, it's extremely centralised. And the book picks up on 4 of these kind of realms, and there's a chapter each really on this. We'll talk about some elements of it as we go through. First of which, trying to understand the financial strategies and this question of risk, which has become much more of an issue for local government and local statecraft now since 2010. The question of external advice, so local governments denuded in capacity, particularly in terms of trying to understand their predicament and plot the way forward towards balanced budgets, have been relying a lot more upon various forms of external advice, auditors, consultants, treasury management advisors, this kind of stuff, some of which has been advising financialization, financial innovation, as we explore in the book. The whole question of borrowing and debt management, and again, this sort of debt addiction element of the councillors at the casino narrative has been examined in the book. And also increasingly, again, a novelty in some senses of how local governments are now increasingly operating outside their own areas, particularly in terms of their investment strategies. So buying commercial properties in buoyant, bouncy commercial property markets in the outer southeast has become a strategy then for local governments that are stuck and situated, trapped, if you like, in property markets that have much less and lower level prospects then for actually generating revenues. So that's a whole new realm, if you like, of statecraft for local government, operating both within and outside their areas. And again, there's another chapter in the book on these sorts of questions. So that's the first one, trying to elaborate this idea of local statecraft, and again, be very interested in people's thoughts around that in terms of connecting it in with discussions around the local state. We wanted to try and understand then as well that, well, what makes this local statecraft distinctive? And there we tried to sort of work on ideas around statehood, which again, typically had been addressed at the nation state level. Writers, political geographers like John Agnew have written a lot about nation statehood and the attributes and characteristics, if you like, that afford nation states power and resources. And we felt this was a useful kind of complementary idea that you could connect with local statecraft. You know, what are the things that actually enable local government to stand out as a distinctive economic and financial actor, which enable it to do certain things, but also constrain it in certain ways in terms of that agency of what it's able to do in terms of its own statecraft across these different realms. And I guess there's sort of 5 elements we elaborate again in the book. You know, the first of which, this is a branch of the nation state often, certainly in the English setting. It's a local part of this. It's connecting in these central local relations, again, in sort of classic political scientists' understandings, that relationship between the national centre and the local government are very important. Bullpitt always argued, you know, the nation state was worried about high politics and local government was always consigned to low politics, you know, just local service provision. Wasn't really doing the big strategic things at the national level. Local government, of course, is in legal terms a local authority. It has certain legal, fiscal and regulatory powers, multiple responsibilities and resources of various kinds, which again make it an important and distinctive actor. And also it governs its local area. It's not just about administering and delivering services. There is a political dimension. This is a democratic political institution, which again, we've heard, I guess, from some of the talks in terms of the extent to which technocracy and depoliticization, de-democratization are kind of processes that local state has kind of been touched by, certainly in the English setting. And again, we'll come back to that in relation to financialization a little later. And there might, I'm sure, be some questions and issues around that and the direction in which this is all traveling as we go through. And when we kind of look, particularly we're addressing only England in the England setting, if you like, in terms of local government. There will be particularities and differences if you were to take this idea and explore other countries in a global north or global south. But it certainly sets up this local statehood, a series of autonomies that local government has, an ability to act set by national governance, regulatory, institutional structures, as we mentioned before, in terms of borrowing this national sovereign guarantee, the idea that local government in England won't go bust. So international investors should be happy to buy its bonds, for example, and lend it money over a period of time, because there's always an implicit, if not explicit, guarantee that the UK state would stand behind them and bail them out if need be. And also certain accountabilities, often very tangled, complex, multi-level accountabilities at the national level, the local level, as well as organisational and political accountabilities to local voters and taxpayers, for example, which are important. So all these elements kind of configure together to create a statehood, if you like, a particular form of local statehood in the English setting. Again, would be different in other settings that we could explore, even within the UK, if you were to look at local government in Scotland, Wales, or Northern Ireland, you'd have some different aspects of local statehood that would make a difference to the local statecraft that local government and local statecrafters could get involved in. So that's the second one. So we've got local statecraft and local statehood as part of the framework underneath that. The third one, and again, we're starting to get into the kind of dimensions, I think, then of councillors at the casino and the extent to which you're getting kind of speculation, innovation, and risk in finance in local government. You know, traditionally seen as a somewhat staid, bureaucratic, fairly boring sort of area, but has now been touched upon by these new financialized ideas. At least that's what the councillors at the casino narrative argues. And I think the book, what we try and do is understand that you've always had innovation and risk in these two different worlds of municipal finance and commercial finance. But perhaps what's happening now is these two things are coming into much greater kind of dialogue and connection as a result of the changes in the English setting for local government since 2010. So what we try to do is a lot going on at the table is really to sort of try and sketch out in broad kind of archetypes form, I suppose, in some senses, and some characteristics, if you like, of these two different worlds, if you like. On the one hand, municipal finance, and on the other hand, commercial finance. And across a range of dimensions, we consider they have quite different sets of actors involved. As we've suggested there with local government, it's all about central local relations. You've got politicians and officials, the statecrafters involved. These are quite different from investors, financiers, and so forth from the commercial world. Their social relations are obviously structured in different ways, with their crucial links then to publics as voters and taxpayers then within local government, whereas finance actors are obviously tied in with investors and broader financial markets. Crucially as well, the objectives, as we've explained now with local statecraft and local statehood, the objectives of local government then and local statecraft then are much, much broader and wider, economic, social, environmental, and so forth, compared to those much narrower kind of economic financial returns, if you like, on investment that shape the world of commercial finance. And their accountabilities are quite different too, in terms of public and formal and legal accountabilities then to national governments and taxpayers, sometimes to external investors and lenders when they've got involved in these things. And obviously then for commercial finance actors too, a whole set of accountabilities. And the frames of action, again, these are kind of characterizations as that can be used to help us think through some of the dimensions on the ground and in empirical instances, but certainly their frames of action are quite different. Municipal finance characteristically has been slow, stable, bureaucratic, longer term and intergenerational. The idea that local governments are custodians of what goes on in the area in perpetuity. There isn't a kind of short-termism to what they do in theory. They treat cash flows and discount rates in different ways if you get into the sort of municipal accounting side of things. And they're traditionally seen as risk averse and only up for incremental forms of innovation. And again, to contrast it with the commercial finance world, a lot faster, more unstable, a bit more short-term, treat cash and cash flows and discount rates in different ways. They're risk-seeking and they look for much more incremental and radical innovations. And their geographies, traditionally in local government, territorialized, immobile, bounded to a particular space over time. Contrasted then with commercial finance, then is this kind of rootless, globally mobile, kind of geographically unbounded finance. So this was just a kind of framework, if you like, to help us kind of think this through. But what we're trying to argue in the book and show is that what you've got with financialization and local statecraft in the austerity decade from 2010 is the kind of collision, if you like, a very uneven and partial collision between these two different worlds that again can begin to help us think about how local statecraft then is actually shaped over time. So that's the third one. The risk is coming through on municipal and commercial finance in terms of innovation in local government funding since 2010. And again, I can commend the fascinating story of Thurrock Council and its solar farm, its £1 billion solar farm investment that the Bureau of Investigative Journalism has put together. And this guy, Liam Kavanagh, and the missing 130 million pounds worth of taxpayers' money. I could see this being a Netflix or Apple TV series at some point. It's really got twists and turns and plots and all the rest of it. But yeah, sadly, it's the reality of what's happened with one local government taking a particular vanguard, leading edge approach to commercial investment. So I recommend having a read of that if that's of interest to you. but that just gives you one instance from this leading edge, if you like, of local government speculation and engagement in revenue generating schemes, which they've been compelled and forced to do then by fiscal pressures then from 2010. Now, the kind of methodology and research design in the book is really underpinned by a kind of critical case view, if you like, of England and local government since 2010. UK offering this very liberal market-oriented, financialised political economy. It's got a certain variegation of capitalism that lends itself to understanding how financialisation might have played through into the local state. So it's helpful in that regard. It's a very long-established, large-scale, big business, multiple functions, multiple services across the country. Highly centralised system, often been a test bed and laboratory for ideas like privatisation and contracting out that have been exported elsewhere. And of course, austerity post-2010 and kind of local government, if you like, in the vanguard of state reductions in expenditure then from 2010, again, as we've heard from other talks from the yesterday and today in the conference. So it's a kind of useful lens, but we're hoping to develop ideas of local statecraft that could be used to explore other settings. The data was, I guess, collected from up to the sort of pre-pandemic period, range of secondary sources, as well as some actor interviews and a few range of match pairs across different local government types then to try and fill out the picture. And I guess we tried to, again, with this conception of local statecraft in our mind, sort of take a multi-actor, so local government at the heart, if you like, but involved in a local state that was made up of now much more varied sets of actors, hybrids, civic organisations, local social movements, even local community groups, private sector stuff, a much more complicated local setting often that local government was working within, as well as their relationships then with the national state. So having to sort of zoom out, in and out, and back again to trace, understand, explain what was going on in terms of the relations, the processes, the arrangements of this local statecraft. That was really the kind of strategy, if you like, for doing the research. So what's been happening then since 2010? Well, we've got a whole series of local government financial strategies. Their local statecraft have been shaped in certain ways amidst austerity, centralisation and risk since 2010. We've had a full decade, if not longer now, of austerity, again, as we've heard from in the other talks as part of this event. Unprecedented level of expenditure reductions, even in contrast to the austerity that local government experienced back in the 1980s. An agenda of localism and local financial self-sufficiency, so reducing local government's financial dependency upon central government. Encouragement of commercialisation and innovation, so local government being encouraged to stand on its own 2 feet to generate more of its own resources. And also, and again, as we've seen in the other talks, it's been fascinating in revealing the depth of growing geographical inequalities and rising demand for local services. So on the one hand, fiscal pressure and stress on local government, and on the other hand, then rising demand then for those local public services, often to address the needs of the most vulnerable members of society locally. So caught in a real bind in terms of continued local service provision under fiscal stress. And this, of course, then in the course of a decade, then was building up bigger and bigger funding gaps, again, very differentiated, as we'll see, between expenditure income and forcing local governments into a position of having to make savings and to generate further revenues and hopefully income from their new activities. So they were kind of backed into a corner, if you like, by austerity from 2010. Again, a lot of this will be familiar. I've seen a little bit of it perhaps in some of the other talks, but just that kind of expenditure reduction then. This is from National Audit Office data, and this is using the government's preferred measure of spending power, as it calls it, which is a particular kind of form of measurement. And you can see roughly a kind of 30% plus reduction in spending power amongst the local governments in England then over that austerity decade. So over a third of their resources, if you like, in terms of spending being taken out. So unprecedented level of expenditure reductions as part of that austerity. You're also seeing as well in terms of what they're spending their money on then, increasingly, it's about adult and children's social care, very expensive, time-consuming services to provide. The other kind of aspects of local government revenue expenditure then being squeezed, even when these relate to other statutory functions like planning and development services have been really squeezed by expenditure reductions, but that adult and children's social care becoming a growing element of what local governments are having to do. So statutory services, legally required services being the key elements involved there. And when you see in their revenue income sources, then you'll see the collapse then in the government funding block, the darkest block at the base of the columns in this chart. And crucially, that kind of dark grey one, the next block up, then locally retained business rates. So this was an emphasis upon local governments then generating more of their own locally generated resources through the property tax on commercial properties, the business rates as it's called in the English system. So again, that constituting, as far as the national government was concerned, then a shift in the funding structure then of local government towards much more local self-sufficiency. But of course, with big geographical differences then relative to the health and buoyancy, the dynamism, if you like, of local commercial property markets. Obviously, those in more prosperous areas then doing better out of that shift in funding compared to those which are much weaker or smaller tax bases in terms of local property tax. Council tax, the residential property tax, obviously constituting a growing element too in terms of revenue for local government over the decade. So that's your first kind of tranche, I suppose, of what's been going on in very broad brush terms, changing structure of local government expenditure and income, growing funding gaps, differentiated strategies starting to emerge, and local government then arguably then trying to move for this fifth point now towards more active and integrated financial strategies and managing risks then to try and make savings and generate income. So what's important here, I think, and again, we've had a flavour of this, I think, in some of the presentations now yesterday and today, is the ways in which we need to understand this austerity and break it down, if you like. It's not just a single homogenous monolithic thing. We need to understand the different nuances and contours of austerity, how it was rolled out over the decade. And that, I think, gives us a better understanding then of what it's constituted, how it's been rolled out, the degree of agency and maybe shaping that might have been involved in terms of how this austerity was managed in different ways in different places across that local government system. Again, National Audit Office analysis is very helpful in terms of understanding that shift. This is a chart from one of their local government financial sustainability reports, which I think nicely captures the way in which the strategies kind of changed across local government in the round within England between the bulk of the kind of austerity period. And you can see in that first kind of tranche, a lot of it was about reductions in service expenditure. So that's the dark columns on the chart, which some appropriations from reserves and other spending. But you start to get these more balanced strategies towards the end, after that kind of what they would describe as low-hanging fruit, easy reductions in discretionary services being made early on in austerity, but then having to find that those kind of small salami slicing type strategies weren't working and they needed to go in for more radical kind of transformational kind of shifts as austerity bore on over the decade. Again, differentiating the kinds of local statecraft across the decade as austerity changed shape a little bit in terms of how national government implemented it, and also how local statecraft responded then, I think, is an important part of that wider story. What we saw as well then, we tried again to give a sort of system-wide view. Again, much of the academic accounts and some of the policy accounts in the Councillors' casino narrative were focused in on a small number of case studies. We've tried to, and I think Mia and colleagues have been doing sterling work on this as well, in terms of giving that bird's eye view, if you like, of the system as a whole. And Mia and colleagues' work on austerity and its implications for different places was very much an inspiration for the work we did in this book to try and understand, well, what does the overall landscape look like? As a foreground to then perhaps more detailed case study work, of which there's been much and it's been very valuable, but trying to really understand that picture in the round to challenge and question a little bit this broader Councillors at the casino narrative. And when you dig into some of the data then to try and understand the data is not helpful in terms of helping you identify financialisation, but you can get near to some of the aspects of it, as we'll see in a moment. And what we found in looking across the piece then in the decade is a very differentiated landscape with overall limited engagements with financialisation, but a degree of differentiation in terms of statecraft between vanguard, intermediate and long tail approaches. And I'll just show you one example of this in terms of, there's one specific indicator. So this is, again, from data that the local governments report to the National Local Government Department. Tend to be pretty ropey, not audited, but they're the best we've got, basically, self-reported things from local government. And this is one indicator that, again, is quite helpful in terms of getting towards, it doesn't nail it completely, I don't think, in terms of financialisation, but it helps us move in that direction of understanding which local governments then have been more active in these sort of financial innovations. So this is an indicator that takes local government interest and investment income, again, worked out by per capita, take out their sort of size effects for local government. And this just tries to give you this indicator a sense then of the extent to which local governments have been involved in statecraft that's really been generating interest and investment income. So have they been buying assets to generate revenues, for example? And this gives you something of a flavour of that. So we have 5 different kinds of local government in the English system: counties, districts, London boroughs, metropolitan districts, and unitary authorities. And as we can see, there's a very differentiated picture if we look at their interest and investment income across the different types over that, well, by 2019-20. So this is where they've got to by the end of the decade, if you like, in terms of their strategies in this particular area. You can see then that you've got a small number then of unitaries, metropolitan and district councils then at the top end of this. So we would see those at the vanguard. You've got a few occupying across the different types of local government in the intermediate position, and a very long tail then of local governments that aren't really doing much of this at all. So again, this is a direct kind of challenge and questioning, if you like, of this councillors at the casino narrative, where you would have expected local governments to be much more involved in vanguard type of behaviours. We can see as well, if we split this out by political control, again, it's the same data, but just split out between the political leadership in the different councils, try and understand whether there's a kind of political political dimension to these strategies. And again, you're seeing this similar pattern then of vanguard, intermediate, and long tail. And interestingly, rather than sort of conservatives being conservative-led councils being gung-ho and looking to generate interest and investment income, it's mostly no overall control and Labour authorities that have been in the vanguard on this particular measure. So a very differentiated picture by political control. And as we do as good geographers, then we like to map this stuff out as well. Again, you've got a bit of a patchwork there of a handful of vanguard authorities, interestingly in the northwest around Manchester and Warrington, Northamptonshire down in the sort of South Midlands, and then Woking, of all places, in the outer southeast, then and Thurrock over to the in Essex, there being quite marked in terms of the vanguard. But again, a sizable intermediate group and a very big long tail with lots of authorities across the country. They're not really very involved in this particular kind of form of financialisation and commercialisation. Clearly, with the local authorities at the vanguard doing this kind of stuff to generate interest investment income, they are sometimes, not always, but sometimes getting involved in more financial innovations to do this kind of stuff, but not always. Some of it is just basic commercial activity by local authorities, but perhaps we can get into the detail of that if people want to talk further about that. But the overall picture, and again, trying to give this bird's eye view, is one of differentiation between a vanguard, an intermediate, and a long tail group. Now, in terms of explaining this, so why does it look like that in terms of this differentiated landscape? And I think there's a number of dimensions really that we felt were shaping these local strategies, these forms of local statecraft, and we could just mention these. And again, quite useful, I think, in terms of trying to get an understanding, at least at that macro or meso level, perhaps subnational level, then of what's going on in terms of financialisation and local statecraft. Clearly, you've got different local governments types and sizes. They've got varying responsibilities, powers and resources. District councils, for example, don't have adult and children's social care responsibilities. So with their reserves and new home bonuses, then they've been able to build up surpluses then that have enabled them create investment funds to put money into commercial property, which is marked them out as different forms of statecraft there. You've got different local politics, political and offer leaderships and experience. Some are more financially savvy. They might have councillors who had backgrounds in commercial property that are pushing these sorts of strategies for the local government as a whole. Different organisational models, expertise, capacities, different openness, if you like, to commercial finance. Some are very against it and their knowledge, their openness to external advice and commercial finance is much more limited, whether that be for political reasons or organisational reasons, or just plain having reviewed it and considered existing tried and tested municipal finance options to be the more effective kind of response. And then lastly, then there's the huge kind of dimension then of the local, sorry, got a cat getting involved in, local economic assets and liabilities, conditions, growth potential and tax bases. So again, going back to that point we made earlier then about the differential revenue that the local governments were able to generate through local commercial property taxation, then this obviously is a big shape then of what local governments have been able to do. So the nature, the fine-grained kind of characteristics, if you like, of their local tax base then has been more important as part of this wider story of what they've been able to do over time. Now, moving on to the last couple of points then. So clearly, when we try and sort of step back and say, well, okay, what does it all mean then? We've put forward these ideas around local statecraft and local statehoods. We've tried to address this particular case of England and austerity and the kind of financial strategies and statecraft that's been active since 2010. We've tried to argue that there's been a range of mixed strategies, but overall, if we look at the landscape, it's very differentiated between these kind of vanguard, intermediate and long tail groups. And if we try and kind of step back and say, well, where's this all going? Is this a kind of new form of local governance, or is it a much more messy and complex picture that we're addressing? And I think certainly in terms of one of the key conclusions then, certainly there's a particular national policy setting. You know, the localism, local self-sufficiency has been sort of compelling local governments into certain forms of statecraft. But we are ending up with a very varied kind of set of engagements with financialization. You know, the vanguard, the intermediate, the local, the long tail groupings, if you like, are quite distinct, very differentiated in terms of what's going on. But certainly where we are seeing those engagements with financializations, there has been a degree of rewiring, rescaling then of what local statecraft's been about. It's introduced new kind of incentives, autonomies and accountabilities. So when local governments like Lancashire County Council have issued a bond, then clearly the bond holders, the people who bought the bond, lent the money to the local government, then become another constituency that in a way that local government then has to address their needs, often reporting to them before they report to their local councillors. So it's kind of rewiring, restructuring these autonomies and accountabilities where you've got those vanguard groups getting involved in these financial arrangements. And certainly in terms of accountability and again connecting into the sort of technocracy, depoliticization themes that had come up in previous talks now over the last couple of days is the extent to which you've got that transparency, that scrutiny, that ability to hold local governments and local statecrafters to account, the politicians and the officers that are getting involved in these new forms of financial innovation and new, more risky, speculative kinds of activities. And one of the worries, of course, is in the financial literacy of both the politicians and the officers involved. As one of the quotes from a former director of a national public audit body said, it's very easy to blind councillors with a complex scheme, present 60 pages of something that nobody really understands rather, that goes by on the nod. So this is a rather worrying kind of prospect that in local council chambers then, when officers and executive leadership groups then are presenting and introducing these kinds of ideas, then how much transparency, scrutiny and accountability is actually at play here. And this does, I think, raise some interesting and worrying questions then about accountability and what these local governments, particularly operating at the vanguard, if you like, of this financialization and commercialization, are able to do and get away with when people are not really able to understand the kind of detail and complexity, if you like, of the kind of financial arrangements that are being proposed, often with very long-term implications, 20, 30, 40-year deals for sale and leaseback schemes on local public assets, for example, which are very complex and often only those with technical financial knowledge are able to actually understand. And again, finally, just this idea then that you in a way, with this collision of municipal and commercial finance as part of this wider local statecraft story in England since 2010, is multiplying risks, reducing margins for error. We're seeing this by the growing number of local governments that have been having to issue what are called Section 114 notices, where they're basically admitting that they can't balance their budgets. So it's the nearest thing we get to a kind of bankruptcy in a local government in the English setting. So we're finding more local governments kind of being trapped and caught in that kind of situation. You're getting a sense of increasing failures, and the whole question then of whether you've got a financial sustainability, resilience, and ongoing local service provision by local government is being questioned, I think, particularly by some of the vanguard and perhaps intermediate kind of responses to austerity since 2010. Now, what's interesting is national government kind of dismisses this as kind of rogue individual cases of weak governance and poor management, rather than anything more systemic and systematic and structural about the way in which local government is funded and what it actually does. But there is quite a consensus across local government that the funding system is broken. It's in need of reform and review that have been deferred, partly due to the pandemic, around fair funding, the balance of funding, if you like, and our business rates and residential property taxes would be reformed. That's kind of been the can's been kicked down the road. It's politically difficult. It's hard to do for national governments, and they perceive that there's not many votes in it. Local taxes are very visible. They're visceral almost to local populations, if you like, in terms of what they're getting for their money. But this whole kind of story, if you like, of financialisation and local statecraft is perhaps raising some interesting questions then about what even the finance actors are asking, which is what's local government for and how should it be funded. So this is one of the quotes we had from one of the director at a bank who've been very involved in financing arrangements with local government, and even they're recognising that there's a fundamental need then to have a grown-up conversation then about what local authorities do. Right, I think I'm out of time, so I just final sort of sentence of summary, really. All I'm trying to do is give you a little bit of a flavour of this Financialisation Local Statecraft book, introducing the idea of local statecraft, local statehoods, and then trying to use it then as a way of explaining then what local government's been up to since 2010 in austerity, in terms of its particular financial strategies and the way in which there's been this differentiated landscape that we can explain across the vanguard, intermediate and long tail approaches, and then to draw some perhaps wider conclusions then that we might want to discuss then in terms of where this is going in terms of accountability, scrutiny and depoliticisation, these kind of themes. So thanks very much for your attention, and looking forward to the discussion and questions. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that. I think that this has been a really useful talk to have at this kind of conference, because it's very easy to say, and I think especially maybe in some of the political economy literature, that there is this retrenchment of services. This is obviously a really common narrative when we talk about things like austerity and financialization. And yet something like this, which I've always found sort of interesting for this purpose, really demonstrates, I think, the way that service provision is restructured quite often, and may really involve quite a heavy risk-taking element, not just on the part of households, but now on the part of local authorities as well, who, in a sense, in the English context, almost get the devolution of risks is, they sort of suffer from the devolution of risk in addition to any sort of additional decision-making powers or powers of competence that the Localism Act has sort of endowed them with. So obviously I can see that Mia and Ariane both have questions. I know that I see that Mia has for a little while, so I'd like to give her the floor for questions and comments now, and then moving on to Ariane before anybody else who may have any.
Thanks, Niamh. That's great. Thank you, Andy. I really always find this really interesting stuff. I have two questions, but I'm going to ask one now, and then if I have time later, I'll come back with the second one. I didn't realize that that some bonds are being issued by some local governments within the UK context. That's really interesting. And I wondered, when you said, I thought that was really interesting when you said, it really forces rewiring of accountability and transparency. And I think back, I've done some research on the US cities that have gone bankrupt, which is really often about this inability to kind of pay back your bondholders, or having kind of the crises come at the wrong moment when you've just refinanced or whatever. And of course, they go through what is, you know, a formal bankruptcy proceeding, where just like in corporate law, you would, you know, stack up your creditors and stuff. I mean, and then you were talking about the 114 notice, which of course is traditionally how we would handle bankruptcy here. Do you think that's going to be challenged? Will it be challenged in the courts by bondholders who say, actually, you know, we need to be represented in a way that Section 114 doesn't? I just wondered how stable you felt the kind of policy infrastructure around that was, or will this really kind of push UK local authorities to be doing something quite similar to their US counterparts?
Yeah, no, that's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, I think this is right. Certainly, with some of the vanguard authorities, it's only been a handful that have actually issued bonds over the years. They've always had the powers to do it, but they kind of have avoided it. Partly, it's a kind of hangover from all the Hammersmith and Fulham, the London Borough in the 1990s, where they got involved in these complex sort of credit default swaps, and ultimately it was decided upon. I think it went up to the House of Lords in the end, where they said it was ultra vires, it was beyond the legal powers of the council, and they voided all these contracts with the banks, which left them with 500 million quid at the time of losses. So commercial finance kind of ran a mile then from local government saying, oh, we don't want to get involved in this. But of course, slowly over time, they've kind of perceived it as being more of a market, and you know, those institutions then that are selling bonds and lining up investors to get involved in bonds. Certainly in the previous kind of post 2008 crash era, low interest rates, you know, the idea of trying to find new markets then to get generate some returns, you start to get some interest in local government bonds by investors. It's not really been tested, of course, in terms of you know, have these local authorities got in a position where they can't kind of pay the coupon on the bond or redeem it at its term. So I think those will perhaps become issues into the future. Of course, what they've done when they've had to issue bonds is get a credit rating, which again is quite a novelty for local government. I think they have to pay something like 50 grand odd to get Standard & Poor's or Moody's or wherever it is to sort of run the rule over them. And I think this is, again, an area where local governments in England have been reluctant to kind of open the books, if you like, to credit rating agencies in the past. And, you know, that kind of constant rating of their financial sustainability and so forth. So perhaps the ones that have issued bonds now get another layer of financial scrutiny by these external actors, which sort of keeps them on their toes, which I guess would be the sort of theory, isn't it, I suppose, of why you engage with external finance. I think on the Section 114 system, interestingly, as you say, Mia, you'll know the select committee that looks at that local government has actually recently done a review and report on whether the system is fit for purpose. This again, it's basically it's a requirement from the Local Government Act back in 1972, I think it was, or something, where they have to, if the local authority is going to post an unbalanced budget, can't balance its income and expenditure in year, it's got to do this annually in year. So then the Section 114 notice then is basically something that they've got to issue to say we can't balance our budget, we're going to be making illegal expenditure, and this is something that's kind of the nuclear option, if you like, that the financial director has to issue if this is going to happen. So it's quite a different setting from a bankruptcy. It's quite rare, although in numbers of this have been increasing, and there's always a sense that national government will send commissioners in, or there'll be some kind of external review, there'll be some kind of reorganization that follows, if you like, the issuing of a Section 114 notice. So from outside, if you're a bondholder sat somewhere else, if this was going on, then clearly you would be perhaps worried about it. But it's often happened in places that have got themselves in a particular pickle about their finances, often to do with housing, house building companies, housing companies, and other sort of commercially questionable stuff. often vanguard behaviours, as we would describe it in the book, and it's perceived and read, I think, by commercial finance actors then as, well, the government won't let them go bust. You know, even though they might be involved in these kind of relatively risky behaviours, ultimately UK government will step in. So there's this kind of implicit UK sovereign guarantee rather than explicit. You know, the Treasury would tell you, oh, that would encourage moral hazard and kind of dodgy decisions. But ultimately, I think the investors think UK government would step in. But it'd be interesting to see if you had a local government that had issued a bond that went kind of, that fell over, and that then sort of asserted the claims of the bondholders then over local taxpayers. But yeah, we haven't had a case of it yet, I don't think. Yeah.
Thanks.
Interesting question. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that really fascinating and thorough. I'm looking forward to reading the book. That sounds really awesome. I also had just a comment briefly and a question, which is one of the points about that you made about the kind of like speculative strategies and like the kind of the blinding of counselors with these, like, you know, large books. It just reminded me of a lot of the kinds of critiques happening around, you know, boards of directors in higher education universities in Canada, right? Like they're signing off on all of these publicly, you know, accountable and managed funds, and yet they may not have the financial literacy to actually understand like what's being hedged. Anyway, that was just a thought that I had. But the question I had for you was about the increasing failures, like that you mentioned towards the end of the presentation. You know, and how this it maps out in kind of certain material ways, like not being able to balance, you know, the bank books, and you know, Mia's just asked a really interesting question as well. But I was kind of interested in like how that, like, are there in the kinds of policy narratives or in the ways that these things get institutionalized or dealt with, managed, etc. Is there like anything like where there's like the failure is a success? Well, we learned from this one bad investment, and now we're just going to keep doing the same thing, but slightly alter the strategy, you know, like this kind of like strange kind of liberal maneuver that often happens when it comes to these kinds of, you know, higher level management and governmental like reasoning about their various strategies. So I was just curious about that, since you kind of focused on the gambling policy narrative, but I was interested whether there was a like, well, now we know better and we're going to keep doing the same thing, even though we've got this increasing rate of failure. So I was just curious about that.
Yeah. Now, these are really interesting points you raise, Ariane. Yeah. I think on the, just on your comment there, I suppose, yeah, about the, I mean, we've looked at local state in this book. We've got a PhD student, Luke Green, Jane Pollard, and I supervising, looking at universities, which are similarly kind of quirky institutions that are kind of getting broad in financialization, certainly in Canada and the US. Luke's PhD research is looking at Manchester and Edinburgh, and they're very much at the vanguard in terms of universities getting involved. And it's a similar kind of thing where you've got a kind of world of university finance, if you like, colliding with commercial finance. And again, universities are slightly odd, have different kind of autonomies and accountabilities, if you like, than the local state and local government. So again, he's trying to sort of think through how that works out there. So I can imagine there's a lot of parallels with the way in which all these kind of opaque sounding councils, senates, and what have you kind of deal with commercial finance actors, which I think there's been some work already, hasn't there, US and Canada on this kind of thing, but I can imagine there's much left to have a look at there. They're slightly different in the sense of certainly in the UK context, UK universities being flush with tuition fee cash and trying to think about what they do with it, really. So that's been a kind of different situation from austerity from local government here. Yeah, on the failures and stuff, I mean, yeah, it is. I mean, there's been so few of them, I suppose. I mean, I did one idea for, again, further paper book or whatever would be to have a look really at this, particularly this dilemma between, you know, is it really kind of rogue actors, weak governance, you know, bad local particular circumstances, if you like, that kind of lead to Section 114s and failure in the English local government system, or how much of this is kind of structural, systemic type stuff. And yeah, they're quite particular often the ways in which these things have unfolded. So on the one hand, you've had a sort of really strong intervention from national government, which has kind of gone in, just declared the local government sort of unfit for purpose almost. So Northamptonshire County Council, for example, in the South Midlands, Conservative-run council got into a bit of a pickle with their particular organisational financial strategy, very strong and contracting out, trying to build this sort of next generation council where everything was kind of contracted and decided by the sort of leadership group. You know, it's close to the old Nick Ridley, New Right kind of, we meet for a council should only meet once a year, distribute the contracts, and then, you know, nothing else to be done really. You know, that kind of model, if you like, of 1980s style New Right local government. So they were moving in that kind of direction in the new sphere, but got into a real financial pickle, and you know, local government sort of value for money reviews, all this kind of stuff, said no, this is a failing local government. It issued a couple, I think, of Section 114 notices, and in the end, government had sent commissioners and did various reviews on it, and they broke it up. They split it up into 2 unitaries in the end. They said that, you know, this is unsalvageable basically as a local government. So you get that kind of very heavy direct national kind of intervention. Interestingly, to try and balance the books, they let them sort of charge some precepts on local council tax. They also let them do a very financialized kind of sale and leaseback deal with Canada Life, the insurance company, on their new headquarters building. So there are a few sort of financial innovations, financialization things at the edge there to try and help them balance the books. So that's one sort of particular example. Where you've got other ones where they've kind of learned, or would argue that they've learned from it, is Warrington, up in the northwest, which have been really sort of gung-ho, vanguard, doing all sorts of stuff. Energy services company, involvement with Redwood Bank, you know, lending to local SMEs. They were involved as well in giving a loan to this THG, this company as well, sort of some internet services company, I think locally too. So very vanguard in what they were doing. And lots of the wheels came off bits of that, but they've kind of just kept going. So again, I think their narrative is very much that this might seem like we're gambling, but actually what we're doing is trying to revenue to offset austerity and save local service provision. So you get very different situations. I think it's quite a differentiated landscape in terms of trying to understand it, but I think it does probably need some more work really in terms of understanding, particularly this dynamic between structural things in a broken system, you know, systemic sort of logics that are playing out, and the extent to which these are kind of bad decisions, bad judgments, rogue actors, if you like, with poor government or poor culture and weak governance. You know, very vague sort of national things that they like to use in explaining why you've got these Section 114 notices. I mean, interestingly, they don't make it public. I mean, I'm not even sure you get it on a freedom of information request, actually, because I think it's probably on the back of an envelope somewhere. But they have an at-risk list, the National Local Government Department, of local authorities that they're sort of actively talking to because of worries about their finances. And our understanding is, certainly through the work we did for the book, was that list has been growing over the last decade, as you might expect. Greater risks, reduced sort of margins for error. You know, you got more local government nearer, if you like, to that kind of unbalanced budget situation where the Section 114 legislation will come into play. Yeah. But yeah, very interesting points you raised, Ariane. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Or Mia, I know that you had a second one that you were thinking about, if you wanted to ask at the moment.
Lovely, I'll jump in while I can. Yes, please. You mentioned Thurrock, and I wanted to ask you, actually, if we had time, to kind of what your take on Thurrock was. I have to say, Andy, as I saw the headlines about Thurrock, was I thinking about local government finance? No, I thought Andy Pike. I did think of your book, and I wondered how you know, are they the vanguard, which are the councillors at the casino table? Yeah. You know, do they fit that image, or is there other things going on that we're less aware of that would make you kind of frame what happened there differently?
Yeah, I mean, they've again been, as you say, the kind of I suppose poster child for what can go wrong with these speculative sort of activities. I haven't really looked in much detail beyond what's been there in the sector press, you know, Local Government Chronicle, Municipal Journal, and that, as I say, that Bureau of Investigative Journalism, Gareth Edwards, I think it is there.
Davies.
Davies,
Yeah,
Dave. Yeah, I interviewed him for the book and stuff, and he's fascinating on all this, and has been doing a lot of sterling work on not only that, but also Lobo loans as well, these lender option, borrower option loans as well, that various local governments got involved in back from the 2000s. Yeah, I think with Thurrock, I mean, you know, again, they seem in terms of the political leadership and the officers there to tell a story then of, yeah, we need to make savings. We needed to generate new revenue sources. We've got multiple responsibilities that are economic, social, environmental, locally. And part of their investment strategy then was about getting involved in the largest one, I think, was this renewable energy scheme. Which, you know, can be presented as decarbonisation. This is about, you know, moving towards and contributing to a wider transition, you know, that will have positive economic, social, environmental benefits then for the people of Thurrock, the local voters and taxpayers, and crucially as well, will enable us to generate some revenue streams then. Now, they've gone into that at scale. They've borrowed a lot, I think, not only from the Public Works Loan Board, which is this body, this arm of the UK Treasury's Debt Management Office, then recycle these lower cost loans then to local government. They've also been involved, and again, this has been another growth element within the kind of austerity story since 2010, in borrowing from other local governments. So this has been another sort of big area where those that have surpluses have been sort of lending at just sub-commercial rates then to other local governments, again, to kind of grease the wheels of these investment strategies and capital funding projects. So they ended up building up a sizable level of debts relative to their sort of balance sheet, which again attracted a lot of attention, suggested that they were being a bit sort of gung-ho, speculative, if you like, on a lot of debt that obviously had to be serviced and then redeemed, paid back then at the end of its term. And then investing then in this big, large-scale renewable energy scheme. Of course, the councillors, the officers will tell you this is transformative, this is vision, this is ambition, this is us trying to deliver for the good people of Thurrock. And it seems like, yeah, they've kind of got involved with some rather shady characters then in this Liam Kavanagh and various kind of shell companies and Cayman Island registers offshore. You know, I mean, Gareth Davis has done a great job in terms of trying to trace down the tails of these things and sort of reveal the overall picture. So have they been unlucky, or has the kind of strategy of speculation and scale and ambition and that kind of led them into these sorts of relationships? Again, I think it'd be a fascinating story to look in more detail at. I think Warrington had an interesting one locally too, in terms of, you know, how far is far enough in terms of speculation and innovation, as you're suggesting, Mia, where they got involved in one of the they purchased a business park in Warrington. So this was an in-area thing, you know, the kind of thing you'd expect the local council to do, but they bought it through an offshore trust, you know, that was kind of located in the Cayman Islands. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up. This was real bread and butter for the councillors at the casino narrative. And it was only when the local MP kind of got hold of it, Helen Ashby, is it? I can't remember her name offhand now. I'd have to check that. But she sort of started to say some slightly questioning things then in the local press then, that I think they went back to try and sort of tidy up the arrangements for it. But there you had this bizarre situation then where a local government responding to national government policy, austerity and reducing funds then for local government, was then actually trying to avoid tax that would then have been due to the national government through their activities. So you have to wonder, you know, the logic and sense, if you like, of national government kind of setting up a system in which local government was being incentivized to operate in these ways. And I think one sentence, maybe could have made more of it in the title of the book, but you know, who's taking the gamble, the local public service gamble here? Is it local governments or is it national government? You know, have they taken the gamble in creating a situation and pressure for local financial self-sufficiency after 2010 that the local governments have been at the sharp end of? You know, and I would have, I think, a lot of sympathy with the politicians and officers I spoke to in terms of how on earth do you balance the budgets in these particular dire situations of fiscal stress.
Yeah, I love that. That's a really good way to kind of further turn the frame that you're looking at, you know. Yeah, nice. Thank you.
Yeah, and on the back of that, I always wondered whether, I mean, I always got the sense, at least from anyone in local authorities that I've spoken to, that you know, endowing local authority with power of competence and lots of things, that lots of the abilities that they had coming out of something like the 2011 Localism Act seemed to work very well for a central government, but entirely by accident, or at least it wasn't necessarily by design. It was just sort of an offloading of, which presumably makes it all the more precarious than to rely on it as a sort of national policy solution when you're thinking about how local authorities actually will sort of consistently make up shortfalls when it comes to the services that they are required to provide, such as like the reduction of homelessness or providing housing to people in crisis. I know we probably can't anticipate an outcome at the moment, just because of how long it would take to develop some of these projects, particularly where sort of insourcing of housing is concerned. But yes, I always got the sense that, I mean, yes, a risk on the part of central government, because there was just a lot devolved to local authorities without any particular strategy for how they were going to make up that shortfall.
Yeah. No, that's right. I mean, it's a very good point you make, Neve. I mean, that Localism Act is a key piece of legislation, I think, for understanding all this as part of that very particular sort of local statehood that shapes local statecraft in the English setting since 2010. You know, it's a very enabling piece of legislation. You know, it really does sort of push the agency down then to kind of give local governments then that general power of competence then to do anything to further the well-being of their local residents and taxpayers, basically. So you're finding that is being used as the legal foundation then for a number of things. Most recently, certainly amongst the vanguard local authorities, then Plymouth City Council, who have actually got involved in an interest rate swap. You know, so echoing the practices from Hammersmith and Fulham back in the 1990s, and basically they're holding up the Localism Act and saying, well, this says we can do this. And we've got I think it was Queen's Counsel at the time, QC's opinion, you know, bought and paid for, that says yes, that legal framework allows you to do that. And again, they're making the argument that they would be, given their particular situation, they're borrowing a debt management strategy, they wouldn't be prudent, they wouldn't be managing public money in an appropriate manner, demonstrating value for money if they didn't get involved in these hedging activities to reduce the risk when they're refinancing some of their short-term debt. So, you know, part of it, and again, this is where I suppose we're asking a question about where this financialization innovation has got to, how far has it kind of seeped into the practices of local government and become, in a sense, normalized, is that, well, okay, if they're not doing what their peers are doing in these vanguard arrangements, then are they managing public money in an appropriate manner? You know, are they being the laggards rather than the innovators in terms of being able to maintain their powers and responsibilities then for local public service provision? So, yeah, the government's caught in a bind because you know, it set up this enabling legislation, as you say, Neve, the Localism Act. It wanted to encourage innovation, local government to stand on their own 2 feet, but then they've got very nervous then when local governments have gone too far down the curve then. So we saw this with, there's a very good report by the National Audit Office, which I used an awful lot, particularly for the in and out of areas statecraft chapter, where it's looking forensically at this investment in commercial property. And it's got very similar kind of groupings in terms of vanguard, intermediate and long tail. But of course, in response to that behavior of those vanguard, then the government and CIPFA, the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountants, then tightened up the regulations and the guidance, you see, on what all local governments could do on the back of the behavior of the vanguard. So they told them they should stop borrowing to invest for yield. They should look at security, liquidity and yield, you know, in that order, you know, in terms of the guidance for their own investment. So you've got that whole kind of local statehood regulation and guidance, if you like, shifted for all local governments across England, all 300 plus local governments, on the back of the behaviour of that relatively small group then in the vanguard, all of whom would argue that they're doing this to offset austerity. You know, this is a common thing, and the Localism Act enables us to do that. It gives us the legal framework against which we can do that. So whether you'll see more of that, Neve, I think, yeah, it'd be an interesting question, particularly post-pandemic, because that's been another kind of strange, obviously, situation for local governments to deal with in terms of pandemic response. Quite a lot of compensation for a national government for certain things, crucially not compensation for a lot of the commercial type activities that local government did, because that was seen as something that they were doing at their own risk.
Yeah.
But then kind of, looking at that in more detail and post-pandemic, I think, there's another book project or two, I think, there, Neve.
Yes, and if there aren't, just checking to see whether there are any other questions, because if not, I will follow up on that with I mean, obviously the work that you're talking about right now focuses quite a lot on their commercial activity and investment in commercial properties. But of course, there is the other activity, as you'll be well aware of, about the establishment of wholly owned companies or of joint ventures and investment partnerships. I'm just thinking, as you're talking about vanguards and following or conforming with him, the fact that several of the local authorities I know mostly through their investment partnerships, and the fact that the people that they work with in these investment partnerships will overlap. And so there's a really interesting creation of networks between local authorities purely in terms of who they're working with when it comes to investment partnerships. And I assume that will probably really affect how local authorities respond to what other local authorities are doing. Yeah,
no, I think so. Yeah, it's a very good point. I mean, I think on a broad sort of academic level, I think, the sort of the breadth and depth and diversity of that local state that the local government is a part of, I think, has certainly grown over the last 10 years, again, in sort of response to austerity and trying to find new ways to provide those key local services. Classic stuff being all this, right to challenge sort of elements within the Localism Act as well, the extent to which communities have stepped up to take on board assets and, some of those discretionary sort of services, libraries, swimming pools, all that kind of stuff. Again, that's kind of brought a whole kind of new layer, if you like. Again, not much research on it. The numbers are a bit ropey as well when you try to sort of get a bird's eye view across the system of what's gone on there. So that local state has expanded, breadth, depth, diversity, I think. I think as well, it's interesting, I mean, to my mind, where the work in the book suggests is a much more of a mixed economy, if you like, of organisation and institutional arrangements across that local government system in England. I mean, there's some more sort of left critique accounts that kind of tell this really quite partial story about hollowed out, contracted out local government. I mean, that's happened in some places, but it's by no means the general picture across local government in England. So again, trying in this book to give a much broader bird's eye view across the landscape, really, of this differentiation, because, there's some filled in, insourced, kind of local government too, where some of these big transformative contracts with the likes of Kier and Capita and so forth have been brought back in-house now, because the local governments want control of the assets and the revenue streams to try and address their problems. The promises of these big transformative contracts just haven't materialized. So that's been a sort of insourcing wave that's been happening too. So it's a very differentiated, complex, variegated kind of picture. There isn't a simple sort of filling in, hollowing out type story. I don't think that's worked through. I think where it gets difficult, Neve, though, is how do you then characterize this? Is this a kind of new era of financialized, commercialized local governance? I'm not sure it is. I don't know if it's there might be signs in some senses that it's heading in that direction, but I'd be very cautious at this stage in saying that that's what we've got. And you've also got a whole range of local authorities involved in more cooperative kind of community wealth building type stuff as well, where very kind of localized alternative kind of experiments which have been played out. I mean, most famously with the Preston model, which Paint Your Town Red, I think, isn't it? It's a local book. I'm just halfway through that at a minute. It's interesting stuff that local government's been attempting to do that locally. So lots of kind of innovations there, and no clear political read-off on these things, I don't think either. I mean, as I was showing there with the interest in investment income, it's hard to kind of say, well, it's all conservative councils that are small state, low tax and all the rest of it. There's certainly some that are, don't see it as a kind of the role of local councils to get involved in private markets and be mucking about crowding out private investment. You know, you'll find that narrative sort of explained in some quarters. But similarly, you'll find other ones that are saying, well, we should deploy the assets and revenue streams that we've got to kind of build up our revenue earning potential and generate income to provide local services for local people and still be conservative led. You know, Portsmouth City Council is interested in that regard. Yeah. So it's difficult to read off simply from their political party and leaderships. A lot of local contingency in there, as you would expect in such a diverse system of 300 and whatever it is today. The number keeps falling now with unitarisation and so. But yeah, it's about 324 or something, I think, at the moment, local governments.
We have about 14 minutes left if anybody has any further questions or comments. I think, yes, there is Ron Paul.
Hi.
Hello.
I have multiple devices that are toppling over all at the same time. Really fascinating to hear your analysis and how it plays out and the difficulties of finding expertise or figuring out responsibility and the link between responsibilization, deresponsibilization. Just a comment, looking at it from a city like Windsor, Ontario's perspective, because it's gone through a period, I think we'd say, of deindustrialization, hit very hard in the early 2000s. But it dealt with casino investment in a different way, which was back in the 90s, attracting Caesar's Palace to be a Canadian location here in Windsor, because we're right across the river from Detroit. And then, of course, 9/11 happens and you have a lot more border control, et cetera. But it reminded me of the different kind of gamble that's being made with postmodern capitalism, where municipal governments are investing many millions of dollars in tourist attractions and experiences that don't necessarily contribute to the quality of life, standard of living, or social health of the immediate community. And municipal government saying, well, we need this type of investment because it will bring in broader dollars that can then go to municipal funds. But some of these are very significant gambles, and many of them don't pay off. I'm wondering, do you see similar types of things with the municipalities that you're looking with or looking at?
Yeah, thanks, Ron John. Really interesting stuff. Yeah, I like the idea of councillors at the casino literally bringing in a casino to to address these things, which of course is tried and tested, I think, in North America as a strategy. Yeah, it is. I mean, I think in many cases you've got local governments that are kind of pushed into more of these kind of riskier, speculative things, as you say, by being just in a bind, really. You know, of having to make savings, having to generate these revenue streams, and almost being compelled and forced into areas that they don't know much about. So they're having to buy in external advice and support to try and check these things out and sort of model revenue implications and all the rest of it. And then, as you say, then going, making decisions on these things and then attempting to sort of manage and mitigate risks then that might become manifest, you know, when the projects don't really come to fruition, or they don't sort of yield the benefits that were initially sort of projected for them. So yeah, I think there's a few examples, I think, where local governments have been kind of caught with this kind of stuff. one comes to mind. So Portsmouth City Council down in south coast of England then got involved in setting up an energy services company, and this was pre sort of Ukraine conflict and the kind of spike in energy prices that we've had in Europe. But this got to the point where it never really traded. They set it up as a kind of corporate entity. The idea was it would generate revenue, it would reduce energy costs then and fuel poverty then for local residents. But it turned out to be too risky a proposition to actually ever trade. So a lot of money and time and expertise was spent kind of getting it to the point at which it might be able to trade and into the energy services market then, but didn't happen. So that's just one corporate example of that. But you certainly had examples as well of capital projects where stuff's actually been built and hasn't really sort of delivered on what the local governments wanted. And national governments kind of encouraged this a little bit too. So we've had a range of what were called city deals, which were these kind of innovative arrangements between national and municipal governments that would allow some flexibilities for those local governments to actually borrow against future commercial property taxes to generate some basically some capital to invest in projects now. So you would basically have a city like Newcastle, where I'm based, borrowing against anticipated future commercial property tax revenues to borrow to get some capital then to invest in refurbishing the central station in Newcastle then, with the hope, and this is the speculation and the gamble, that that investment with infrastructure then would trigger and yield those, actually generate those commercial property tax revenues then into the future to enable them to pay off the borrowing, to service the debt and to redeem the debt at the end of its term. Now, the jury's out, and often these things, Ron John, are sort of knocked into the future. This is a 10, 20, 25-year gamble, and today's politicians and officials that are making those decisions and locking the local government into those deals then ain't going to be around in 10, 15, 25 years, are they? So this is the interesting thing. It's kind of a deferral, if you like, of the responsibility for what happens to these bets, pushing it into the longer run.
Are you seeing evidence of backlash against this, but on a not so smart, shall we say, fiscally conservative approach? So one thing we're actively debating here in Windsor as we reindustrialize on the electric vehicle side of things, right, Windsor being an automotive hub, is the municipal government saying, okay, we've attracted an electric battery plant. It's being built. Some other stuff is going to be built, but they want to fund the development of the municipal infrastructure for an entire new subdivision for this factory: roads, sewers, water, drainage, flood mitigation. But it looks like they want to do it off current account, even while saying this is a generational investment. So instead of saying, okay, well, let's hedge it, let's offer bonds, let's level out the costs over a period of time. No, we need to be more conservative, fiscally conservative. So now we're going to try to do most of it off current account, which then means property tax increases for current residents.
Yeah, that's a novel strategy. That's certainly a financial innovation. I think they'd get a lot of pushback on that in England. Yeah, I mean they often find it easier to do the capital projects. Government will much more readily give local government in England capital funding because it's into the future. It's not on as you say current account stuff. They'll do it in those terms, and often local government will more readily be able to access financing for capital projects, from Public Work Loans Board, this quirky institution that we have that sort of recycles government bonds, UK government bonds, with the UK sovereign back in to provide cheap lending then for local governments, and borrowing as well off other local governments too. So they're usually okay in terms of being able to access capital funding to do these sorts of things. And yeah, in that situation where it was seen as a sort of transformative new growth pathway for the local economy, then I think you'd probably find them trying to do that kind of stuff, really. I mean, you've seen it locally. I mean, the kind of where you've had swing councils, where you've had a bit of political change, maybe between Conservative or Liberal Democrat led councils in England, where the kind of more gung-ho Conservative version of these financialized and commercialized kind of projects then has been criticized then by the Liberal Democrats when they sort of take control, and this is kind of tidying up the speculative mess that's been left behind. You know, you get these sorts of stories, I think, in some local governments. But public backlash, it's interesting. Not really, I don't think. There hasn't really been a degree of kind of public engagement, knowledge, or ability to sort of scrutinize and pay attention and sort of hold to account, I suppose, these kind of things. I mean, as you say, the councillors are struggling to do this. I mean, it's interesting because in the early days of austerity, the idea from a former Secretary of State at the time, Eric Pickles, now Lord Pickles, argued that you'd get a whole new kind of era of armchair auditors, as he called it. You know, if we could render the finances of local government more transparent, then, you know, they would be held to account by these vigorous, engaged, active local publics. It just hasn't happened. I mean, it's really it's an interesting thing to look back on, and whether that's through public apathy and disinterest, or genuine kind of ignorance and, you know, lack of knowledge with these newfangled complex kind of financial schemes. You know, who's out there reading these 60-page documents on income strip deals, you know, for the local ferry terminal, you know, as they did down in with Canada Life. Actually, it was the big insurance company down in Portsmouth. They did this income strip deal with for the ferry terminal, where quite a complicated sort of financialized kind of thing with an international insurance company that wasn't a straight up privatization, because it was only for a 40-year term, I think. So that it was allowed to be portrayed locally then as this kind of almost free money. You know, we get a better rent from the ferry terminal, they'll give us it back after 40 years. You know, it's a win-win for everybody. So unless you really sort of begin to scrutinize and have great understanding about what they've actually done with that deal and the risks involved with it, then again, it goes by on the nod. People aren't really that engaged. Certainly not going to organize politically against it, Roger. But yeah, very interesting points. Yeah, and the parallels with the North American stuff is fascinating.
Just reminds me of Ariane's comment about university boards, etc. That maybe transparency is a tactic of de-responsibilization. Oh, it's out there, so, you know, if something goes awry, that's on everybody.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, no, thanks, Roger. That's very good. Yeah, indeed. I mean, I think the university one, as I say, Luke Green, one of our students, is busy kind of writing that up at the moment. But yeah, there is an interesting kind of dimension to that. We see it a little bit with this kind of transparency, not transparency thing with some of the local government stuff, which you came across, because of course you've not only got this sort of, I guess it's a sort of default lack of transparency because this is really complicated stuff and you've got to know, you know, what all this is about and have some technical knowledge of the commercial finance things that are going on. By which I would say I'm not an expert at all. I mean, I've become an interested amateur, I think, in these sorts of things in doing the book, but crucially try to render it a bit more accessible to people in doing the book. That's one thing. But also as well, you get a lot of redactions. You get hold of these documents and half of it's not there because it's commercially sensitive. So actually doing the research on this stuff and uncovering the detail, as you're saying, Ron John, of what's really going on here, you know, is either you don't understand it, it's very technical, or it's literally been redacted and you've got these kind of black marker sections through the thing, you know, where it's local state secrets are at work here, it's commercially sensitive, we can't sort of open this up to further scrutiny and transparency. And then you kind of hit a dead end. And it's interesting with the demise of our local press, you know, that used to be much more kind of active in holding local governments to account, you know, local journalism, local investigative reporting. You know, I did a session with some, there's a BBC network of local government reporters the other day just about the book stuff. And they were saying, well, how do you chase down the loose ends of all this stuff? And, you know, they found it difficult, even with our freedom of information request stuff. It's really hard to get to the bottom of these things. You know, you hit this wall of commercial sensitivity or, you know, very selective responses to freedom of information requests. So, yeah, the transparency is, as you say, yeah, it's quite a slippery thing, I think. Yeah.
Obviously, I would love to continue this conversation, so it's unfortunate that we do have to cut it short. So thank you very much for that that talk and for the discussion that's followed that. That's been really interesting, really, really useful, I think, hopefully for everybody. And yes, I just thank you very much for taking the time for that presentation.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. Yeah, really good. Nice to present, get the opportunity and connecting with some of the other themes people are working on, and yeah, some fantastic questions and discussion. So yeah, thanks very much. Been really thought-provoking. Thank you.